2 weeks before Christmas, Mr. John's house buzzed with excitement. Laughter echoed through the halls as the children dashed up and down, chattering eagerly about their upcoming trip to the village. Their hearts brimmed with joy, imagining the fresh air, towering trees, and the endless games they would play with their cousins. To them, the village was a magical haven, a place where time slowed down and every moment felt alive. They couldn't wait. But this year, something dark and unseen lingered in the shadows, waiting to shatter their joy in ways they could never imagine. Mrs. Yu, ever the diligent mother, was busy packing clothes and preparing snacks for the journey. Her hands worked tirelessly, folding shirts, baking treats, and ensuring everything was perfect. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, her heart was heavy with unease. She glanced at her husband, who sat casually reading a newspaper. "John, please," she said softly, her voice tinged with urgency, "let's pray. Just for a minute. Let's ask God to guide us and keep us safe." Mr. John chuckled, waving her off as if swatting at a pesky mosquito. "Yu, we've traveled this road 100 times. God knows I'm traveling, He doesn't need me to remind Him." His laughter filled the room, but it only deepened the ache in Yu's chest. She sighed, turning back to her task, her prayers silent but fervent. "Why won't you understand?" she whispered under her breath. Her husband's indifference to prayer hurt her deeply, but what pained her more was the influence it had on their children. The older ones had started to mimic him, rolling their eyes whenever she knelt to pray. "Mama, do we really have to do this every day? It's boring," they would complain, dragging their feet to join her. But Yu never stopped. Even as they grumbled, even as her husband dismissed her, she prayed every morning and every night, asking God to protect them. She prayed for her family's safety, for their unity, and for her husband's heart to soften. The house was alive with laughter and anticipation as the children talked about their plans for the village. Mr. John smiled at their excitement, basking in the warmth of their joy. But Yu sat quietly at the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched her family, her heart swelling with love, but weighed down by a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. "Lord, please," she whispered silently, "keep us safe this Christmas." The days crept closer to their journey, and the family remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. What awaited them on the road was not just a test of their faith, it was a moment that would tear through their lives and leave them forever changed. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, Yu stood at the window, staring out at the fading light. She felt it again, that strange, unshakable weight pressing on her chest. Something was coming. Something that would challenge everything they believed in. And it was closer than they realized. Mr. John was driving home from work, the hum of the engine blending with the quiet rustling of the evening breeze. His mind wandered to the upcoming journey to the village, his children's laughter, his wife's careful packing, the warm embrace of family awaiting them. As he turned a sharp corner, his headlights illuminated an old woman standing by the roadside, her frail figure wrapped tightly in a faded wrapper. She raised a hand, waving urgently for help, a small woven basket tucked under her arm. Curious, Mr. John slowed the car and stopped beside her. Leaning out of the window, he asked, "Mama, where are you heading to?" The old woman's voice was soft but weary. "My son, I'm going down the next street. Can you take me there?" Mr. John nodded. "Of course, Mama. Get in." The old woman climbed into the passenger seat with care, settling quietly as the car pulled back onto the road. For a while, the ride was filled only with the low hum of the engine and the faint chirping of crickets outside. The old woman sat still, her hands resting lightly on her basket, her face unreadable. Then, she cleared her throat. "My son," she said, her voice low but deliberate, "I hope you won't be offended by what I'm about to tell you." Mr. John glanced at her, intrigued. "What is it, Mama?" The woman drew a deep breath, as though summoning courage. "This Christmas, you must not travel to your village. And if you must go, you and your family should pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead." Her words struck like a sudden chill in the warm night air. The weight of her tone made the hair on Mr. John's arms rise, but he quickly brushed it off with a hearty laugh. "Mama, you want me to cancel our trip because of a warning? This isn't my first time traveling for Christmas, nothing has ever happened. We'll be fine." His voice was confident, almost dismissive, as he shook his head. The old woman didn't smile. Her eyes, dark and solemn, seemed to pierce through him. "I've said what I came to say, my son. The rest is up to you." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. When they reached her destination, Mr. John stopped the car, and the old woman climbed out. Before closing the door, she turned back to him, her gaze steady. "Thank you for the ride. But remember my words, pray and fast if you must go. There is more at stake than you realize." Mr. John waved her off with a smile. "Thank you, Mama. Take care." He watched her disappear into the shadows before driving away. As he continued down the road, he chuckled to himself. "Why do people always try to scare others with these strange warnings?" he muttered. To him, she was just another superstitious elder, perhaps trying to sound wise or important. He'd traveled this road countless times, and nothing had ever gone wrong. But as the car disappeared into the night, the old woman's words clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. Somewhere deep in his chest, a tiny seed of unease began to grow, though he refused to admit it. As the evening deepened, the old woman remained by the roadside, her frail silhouette etched against the fading light. Her face was unreadable, her expression caught somewhere between grief and resignation. The words she had spoken were no longer hers to bear, the weight of what lay ahead was now in the hands of those who had heard them. 2 days before Christmas, Mr. John's house buzzed with energy. Bags stuffed with clothes, gifts, and snacks were stacked neatly by the door, awaiting their journey. The children raced around the living room, their laughter filling the air as they talked endlessly about the village, the games they'd play, the cousins they'd see, the adventures they'd have. For the children, the trip was a promise of freedom and joy. Amid the chaos, Yu moved gracefully, her calm demeanor a quiet contrast to the excitement around her. Before they left, she gathered everyone into the living room. "Let's pray before we go," she said, her voice soft but resolute. Mr. John groaned, rubbing his temples. "Yu, what is it with you and prayers? We're not crossing an ocean or going to war, it's just a village." "Let me go warm up the car," he said dismissively, waving her off as he headed outside. Yu sighed, her heart heavy but steady. She knelt down with the children, folding her hands as she whispered her familiar plea. "Lord, protect us. Guide my family. Keep us safe." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her faith remained firm. Outside, Mr. John slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition with confidence. The car responded with silence. He frowned, turning the key again. This time, the engine coughed weakly, sputtering as though trying to come alive, but then fell silent once more. "What is this now?" he muttered, stepping out of the car. Lifting the bonnet, he stared blankly at the engine, as though expecting it to explain itself. He jiggled some wires, tapped a few parts, and tried again. Still, nothing. Frustration simmered in his chest as he slammed the bonnet shut and marched back inside. "The car won't start," he announced, scratching the back of his head. "I don't know what's wrong with it." Yu looked up from where she knelt, her expression calm but knowing. "Maybe God doesn't want us to go," she said softly. Mr. John's frustration boiled over. "Stop saying that. What does God have to do with a car engine? It's a machine, Yu. Machines break. I'll call the mechanic." The mechanic arrived quickly, his tools clinking as he worked under the bonnet. Mr. John paced nearby, muttering to himself about how the car had been perfectly fine just yesterday. After a few minutes, the mechanic straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was serious. "Olga, the engine has knocked," he said, shaking his head. "This car isn't going anywhere until it's completely fixed. It may take a few days." Mr. John's jaw dropped. "Knocked? How? I drove this car yesterday, and it was perfectly fine." He stared at the mechanic, as though searching for a better answer. The mechanic shrugged. "Sometimes these things happen, Olga. It's out of our hands." Inside the house, Yu watched her husband silently. Her expression was calm, but in her heart, she whispered another prayer. Perhaps this was not a coincidence. Perhaps this was God's way of holding them back. But would Mr. John ever see it that way? As he stood outside, staring at the lifeless car, a nagging thought crept into Mr. John's mind: the old woman by the roadside, her solemn warning, her insistence on prayer and fasting. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, though he quickly pushed it away. Surely, this was all just bad luck. Or was it? The mechanic shrugged again, wiping his hands on his greasy rag. Sometimes these things just happen, sir. It's beyond me. Yu smiled faintly, her voice steady as she said, God knows why. Mr. John snorted, his frustration boiling over. God knows why, he mimicked sarcastically, throwing his hands in the air. So now what? Are we just supposed to sit here and cancel Christmas? His pacing quickened, his frustration spilling into every step. Yu said nothing. She simply sat quietly, watching her husband as he stormed back and forth like a caged lion. After a while, Mr. John clapped his hands sharply, as if sealing a decision. We'll go to the park and take a commercial bus. It's not ideal, but we'll still get to the village. Yu frowned, the unease in her chest growing heavier. Maybe we shouldn't go at all, she said gently, her voice laced with quiet concern. Don't start again, Yu. Mr. John snapped, his voice cutting through the air. I've made up my mind. We're going. His tone left no room for argument, and with that, the matter was settled. The bags were repacked for the bus, and the children, still bubbling with excitement, prepared for the journey. But as Yu helped the youngest tie her shoes, her heart felt like a stone sinking in her chest. She whispered once more, barely audible, Lord, take control. Meanwhile, far away in the quiet village, the air hung heavy with anticipation. But not everyone was happy about Mr. John and his family's yearly Christmas visits. Mama Amaka sat outside her mud house, her calloused hands resting on her lap as she stared down the dusty road. Her face was twisted with bitterness, her thoughts turbulent and dark. Every year, it was the same. Mr. John and his family arrived like royalty, their shiny car catching the sun and drawing every pair of eyes in the village. His wife, Yu, and their bright, happy children looked well-fed, well-dressed, untouchable. Meanwhile, Mama Amaka's 4 sons could barely scrape together enough money to return home, and when they did, it was on rickety bicycles or on foot, their faces worn with struggle. Her fingers clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Why must every Christmas be about John? She muttered, her voice shaking with resentment. Her heart boiled with jealousy, and the bitterness she had carried for years finally reached its breaking point. This year, she decided, things would be different. This year, John and his family would not come here to flaunt their wealth. Mama Amaka stood abruptly and called for her closest confidant, Mama E. Her voice was low and urgent. Sister, she said, her face dark with determination, I cannot take it anymore. This year, that boy and his family will not come here to show off like kings. Mama E, whose sharp tongue was as notorious as her fiery temper, nodded in agreement. You are right, Amaka, she said, her eyes narrowing. It's time you did something about it. Without hesitation, the 2 women set off together, their bare feet kicking up the dry dirt of the village road. They headed for the forest, their resolve burning hotter with every step. The path grew darker as the trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The air grew still, heavy with an unnatural silence that seemed to press against their skin. Deep within the forest, hidden from the eyes of the village, they reached their destination, a small, crumbling hut that reeked of smoke and decay. This was where the village witches lived, their powers whispered about in fearful tones, but never openly acknowledged. Mama Amaka stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She clenched her fists tightly, her voice trembling with fury as she spoke. This year, she said, her words cutting through the silence, John and his family will not make it to this village. They will not humiliate me again. One of the witches, her face obscured by shadows, chuckled darkly. You've come to the right place, she said, her voice a low rasp. But beware, Amaka. What you asked for has a price. Mama Amaka didn't flinch. Whatever it takes, she said firmly. Just make sure they don't come. The witches began to chant, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmony as the flames of their fire danced higher into the night. Far away, as Mr. John and his family prepared for their journey, something stirred, something unseen, something dark. and the road ahead grew more dangerous than any of them could imagine. The cold wind whistled through the dark forest as Mama Amaka and Mama E approached the witch's hut. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The twisted trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. When they reached the crumbling hut, a chill ran down their spines. The structure seemed alive, the door creaking open as though welcoming them into its sinister embrace. Inside, the leader of the witches sat by a bubbling cauldron. Her face was as wrinkled and brittle as a dried leaf, her eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. She turned to the visitors, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Why have you come?" she demanded, her tone both curious and threatening. Mama Amaka dropped to her knees, her head bowed low. The words spilled from her lips like venom. "I need your help. My stepson, John, he must not reach this village alive. His success has mocked me and my children for too long." At this, the witches erupted into laughter, the sound jagged and sharp, echoing off the walls like shattering glass. The leader leaned closer, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice a low growl. "Consider it done." The witches began their work immediately, gathering around their cauldron, which bubbled with a thick, black liquid that hissed and spat. One of them reached for a piece of cloth Mama Amaka had brought, a fragment of John's shirt from his last visit. She tossed it into the cauldron, and the liquid roared as if alive. Another witch added ashes, muttering an incantation that twisted the very air around them. The words were ancient, dark, and powerful, making the hut tremble. The leader raised her hand, and the room fell silent. Her voice was cold and final as she declared, "They will not reach this village alive. A deadly accident awaits them on the road." Mama Amaka's heart swelled with dark joy. She handed over a small leather pouch of coins as payment, her hands trembling not with fear but with anticipation. The witches laughed again, their voices echoing like a storm as they completed the curse. The leader looked at Mama Amaka, her eyes burning with malice. "It is done," she said, her voice as heavy and unyielding as stone. Mama Amaka left the hut that night, the cold biting at her skin, though her heart burned with triumph. Her mind raced with visions of John's car smashed beyond recognition, his family gone, and the villagers mourning their beloved king. Finally, she thought, there would be no one to overshadow her sons. Finally, she would have her peace. She stood, her hands clutching the seat in front of her for balance, and looked around at the passengers. Her voice was calm but resolute. Some passengers nodded and closed their eyes, joining her in silent agreement, while others turned away, whispering to themselves or cracking faint smiles of disbelief. Mr. John's face flushed crimson with embarrassment, his jaw tightening as he hissed through clenched teeth, You, sit down. You're embarrassing me. This is a bus, not a church." But You didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge his protest. Instead, she closed her eyes, her voice unwavering. "Lord, protect us on this journey. Cover this bus and everyone inside it. Keep us safe from harm. Amen." A few passengers muttered amen in response, their voices hesitant but sincere, while others rolled their eyes and exchanged knowing smirks. Mr. John slumped back in his seat, shaking his head in frustration. "She'll never change," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. The bus rumbled to life moments later, the engine's growl drowning out lingering whispers. Slowly, it pulled out of the bustling park, merging onto the road as the city began to fade behind them. The laughter of the children filled the air, their voices full of excitement as they pointed out buildings, cars, and trees racing past the windows. Mr. John, feeling the rhythmic sway of the bus and the gentle hum of the engine, let his head rest against the cool glass. Before long, his eyes fluttered shut, and he drifted into a light sleep. For a while, everything was peaceful. The road stretched endlessly ahead, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun. The passengers settled into the journey, lulled by the steady hum of the bus. But peace has a way of shattering when it's least expected. Suddenly, a sharp, panicked voice cut through the air. "The brakes! The brakes are not working," the driver shouted, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled desperation. The bus lurched violently, and chaos erupted. Passengers screamed, clutching at seats and each other as the vehicle swerved uncontrollably, veering from one side of the road to the other like a wild animal. Bags and belongings tumbled from the overhead racks, crashing to the floor. Yu pulled her children close, wrapping her arms tightly around them, her lips moving in a prayer too quiet to hear. Ahead, a tanker truck loomed, its massive frame dominating the narrow road. The driver wrestled with the wheel, his face a mask of terror, but the bus hurtled forward, unstoppable. The sound of screeching tires and panicked cries filled the air, growing louder and louder with every passing second. Time seemed to slow. The distance between the bus and the tanker shrank impossibly fast, yet every heartbeat felt like an eternity. Yu's voice suddenly rose above the chaos, strong and desperate. "Lord, save us," she cried, her words cutting through the cacophony like a blade. And then, with a deafening crash, it happened. The bus slammed into the tanker. Metal groaned and twisted, glass shattered into 1,000 shards, and the world was swallowed by a deafening silence. Far away in the village, the wind carried whispers of the accident, as if the earth itself mourned. The news traveled swiftly, spreading like wildfire through the quiet streets and into waiting ears. But what no one knew, what the wind could not yet tell, was who had. In Mr. John's village, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets hummed with murmurs. People gathered in tight clusters, their voices hushed and heavy with shock. "Did you hear? John and his family were in a terrible accident," one woman whispered, her face pale. "God have mercy," another muttered, shaking her head. The news spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the village. It wasn't long before Mama Maka heard it too. Her reaction was instant. She flung herself to the ground, wailing loudly, her wrapper flying loose as she beat her chest. "Oh, my son! My stepchildren! What have we done to deserve this?" she cried, her voice rising for all to hear. Her performance was flawless, her tears falling in streams as villagers gathered to console her. But deep inside, hidden beneath the crocodile tears, a wicked joy danced in her heart. Her plan had worked, or so she thought. "Now no one will come to overshadow my sons," she told herself, her cries nothing more than a mask for the triumph bubbling within her. Meanwhile, at the crash site, rescue workers combed through the wreckage, their faces grim at the sight of the mangled bus. But amidst the chaos, a miracle had unfolded. Yu and her children were found, huddled together, shaken but completely untouched. Not a single bruise marred their skin, not a scratch smeared their faces. It was as if an invisible hand had shielded them from harm. Mr. John, however, had not escaped so easily. He had been sitting in the front seat, and the force of the collision had crushed his legs. He was alive, but his injuries were severe, his legs mangled beyond repair. When the rescuers finally freed him from the twisted metal, he was rushed to the hospital, his family trailing behind, their hearts heavy yet grateful he was still breathing. At the hospital, Yu knelt by her husband's bedside, her children huddled around her, their small hands clutching her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she prayed, her voice trembling. "Lord, you saved us from the accident. Please, don't take my husband. Let him live." The doctors worked tirelessly through the night, their faces lined with determination. Mr. John's injuries were grave, but by morning, he opened his eyes. Weak but alive, he looked around at his family, who burst into tears of relief. The news of his survival spread quickly, and Yu's heart swelled with gratitude as she whispered silent thanks to God, her prayers answered. Later that day, as the afternoon light filled the hospital room, the door creaked open. The old woman, the same one Mr. John had helped days before, walked in. Her steps were slow but deliberate, her small frame carrying an air of quiet authority. She stood by his bedside, her eyes filled with a knowing look that pierced through the room. "Do you remember me?" she asked, her voice soft yet commanding. Mr. John, pale and weak, nodded faintly. "Yes, Mama," he whispered. The old woman pulled up a chair and sat down, her gaze never leaving him. "I told you not to go to the village this Christmas," she said, her voice laced with both sorrow and certainty. "I warned you to pray and fast, but you did not listen," the old woman said, her voice soft but unyielding. She shook her head slowly, her gaze piercing. "If not for your wife's prayers, you and your children would be gone by now." Mr. John's eyes filled with tears. He turned to look at Yu, who stood silently by his bedside, her hands clasped tightly together. She had prayed for him, for their family, even when he had refused to believe. The old woman's voice carried on, calm but heavy with truth. Your stepmother, Mama Amaka, and the village witches planned this evil. They cursed you, but God is greater than their schemes. It was your wife's prayers that built a shield around your family. The weight of her words hit Mr. John like a flood. He broke down, his shoulders shaking as tears streamed down his face. I was foolish, he whispered, his voice trembling with regret. I didn't listen. I didn't pray. The old woman placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. Let this be a lesson, she said gently. Never underestimate the power of prayer. Never ignore the warnings of God. From that day forward, Mr. John was a changed man. Once he was discharged from the hospital, he embraced his second chance at life with humility. Every morning, he was the first to gather his family for prayers, kneeling beside you and thanking God for his mercy. On Sundays, he was always the first in church, his voice rising above the congregation in heartfelt worship. As for the village, Mr. John never returned for Christmas again. The memory of the accident and the knowledge of his stepmother's betrayal kept him away. The pain of what had been planned against him was too great, and he chose to protect his family by staying far from the place where jealousy had festered. It wasn't until years later, after Mama Amaka passed away, that Mr. John finally returned to the village. This time, he came with a humble heart and a spirit full of gratitude. He no longer sought to impress or overshadow anyone. His visit was one of peace, reconciliation, and quiet reflection. The story of Mr. John's accident and miraculous survival spread far and wide, becoming a lesson etched into the hearts of many. It was a tale that reminded people of the power of prayer, the unseen dangers that walk among us, and the painful truth that not everyone celebrates your success. Mr. John's life was a testimony, a beacon of faith, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God's protection shines brightest when called upon.